President Trump is right to say that we don't spend enough. It's time to invest. We all need to be realistic about Russia. Russia poses existential threat to our security today, tomorrow, and for as long as we underinvest in our defense.
To what extent, Doug, do you think that she believes any of that stuff? Or is it like, no, this is just what we have to say because the key word there is invest, i.e. spend a lot more in the defense industry?
A couple of points. First of all, is this lovely Miss Kaya Kallas, is she from Lithuania? If not, she could be from Latvia, potentially, or Estonia. The reason I'm bringing that up is that the people in those countries were traumatized by the Second World War and their mistreatment at the hands of communists, which is why they greeted the liberating German forces with flowers and bread and salt and so forth, just as they did in Ukraine. These people have never gotten past that trauma, and they are believing in a Russia that doesn't exist today, that is a Soviet-style state led by Stalin and millions of soldiers ready to sacrifice themselves and rape, pillage, murder, and burn. That's just nonsense. So that's part of the problem. I don't know how you fix that, but if you could, maybe Gary can find out where she's from. Where is she from, Gary? Estonia.
From Wikipedia, an Estonian politician and diplomat, yes.
Yeah, she's from Estonia. And these small countries, first of all, have very rarely been countries. You know, they were largely incorporated into other larger empires or confederations. And those countries on the Baltic, along with Scandinavia, were almost German colonies in much of the Middle Ages. We could spend a lot of time on it, but I'm trying to explain that her thinking is consistent with the attitudes and beliefs of the people that live in those areas for the last 60, 70, 80 years based upon their experience. The problem is that experience is no longer relevant because that state that was so heinous and evil that had been built up by the Bolsheviks and Stalin is gone. That is not Putin. Putin is none of those things. And we have tried relentlessly to tar and feather Putin with that reputation. So she's talking about an enemy that doesn't exist. Secondly, during World War II, the Soviets looked at how we were conducting the war and concluded that they were very fortunate. And they were fortunate insofar as they didn't have to deal with quote unquote unruly allies in the East. Oh, there were Polish-speaking divisions inside the Soviet army. There were Ukrainian-speaking forces inside the Soviet army. There were lots of different people inside the Soviet army, but they were all under the Soviet army. They were under one unified chain of command. And so those armies could be wielded as a very effective instrument. Neither we nor the Germans, the Nazi state, were able to do that. So we maintained independent formations, Hungarians and others in the East that fought with Romanians and Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and independent national formations, the Germans, and in the West, we used independent French and British and Canadian and U.S. formations. And we had to negotiate our way through the war. We had to ask people to do things. We had to build consensus. It was a catastrophe. It's one of the reasons we got so far, or I would argue we got so little in terms of distance in such a long period of time. We cannot compete in this conglomeration of nations that she's pointing to with any degree of unity of effort against Russia. The Russians have unity of effort. That's the important part. If you have unity of effort, you have unity of command. So she's smoking something, and it's probably not a cigarette.
Okay, well, that's pretty clear. Bottom line, whatever she intends, it's not really going to translate into anything positive for Europe. I want to go back again to read something from your book from later on in the same chapter that I was reading here before, because it talks about things toward the end of the war, and it seems to me that I see something playing out right now. As a preface to this, I mean the situation right now, Velika Novoselica is the latest city to have fallen on the Ukraine side. It was one of the fastest that the Russians have been able to take a city since late 2023. Now then they're starting to move more and more in, and evidence appears that they're about ready to start the actual assault on Pokrovsk, which could then just unhinge the entire Eastern Front, depending on how fast or how aggressive the Russians want to go onto there. But in any case, we already told you that the Ukraine side is shrinking by the day because they can't offset losses. Their formations are dissolving when they get into the front. So everything makes it look like that the war militarily is over. That sounded familiar because of what that I read here in your book earlier. You said the Wehrmacht, the German army, was defeated in World War II because Hitler and his generals disregarded one of the most important principles of international conduct articulated about 110 years earlier by Clausewitz. No one starts a war, or rather no one in his senses ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it. The former is political purpose. The latter is operational objective. From July 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht in Russia lacked definitive operational purposes and attainable strategic objective. By 1944, January 44, the Wehrmacht's margin of victory was effectively lost. German soldiers and forces fighting with them from Finland, Hungary, Croatia, Romania, and Spain simply defended their assigned sectors to the best of their ability and often to the death. And that sounds so much like what is going on in Ukraine right now. There is no military purpose to anything they're doing. They're just hanging on to cities like Velika Novoselka, like Pokrovsk, with no connection to anything else. And how can it have any outcome other than what happened to the Germans in 1945?
Well, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, everybody has talked routinely about harming Russia. What is the purpose of the proxy war against Russia? Is it to create a unified, strong, independent Ukraine that can determine its own destiny? No, it's to harm Russia. What happens to Ukraine is frankly irrelevant. No one cares. There's no one in Washington sobbing over the loss of 1.2 million Ukrainian lives, which is the current estimate that I'm looking at. No one cares. It's irrelevant. We're harming Russia. That's good. The problem is if you're looking at 90 to 100,000 Russian dead and the largest, most powerful and effective army in Europe, certainly since the end of the Second World War, I don't think we've done much harm unless it's to ourselves. So again, Clausewitz was right. What is your purpose? If anybody had looked at that from any from any logical angle, they would conclude this is insane. This is crazy. This is what you want to do. You want to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives on the assumption that doing so will harm Russia. Well, that's failed. And this goes back to the other point that I made. If you're President Trump, this is not your war. You didn't start it. You don't need it. You don't want it. Get rid of it. This is dead weight. You know, he's a businessman. When you've invested heavily in a particular stock or in a particular corporation and it fails miserably, what do? You cut your losses and you get out. That's what he needs to do. And he needs to then turn around and say, we have a different objective in Ukraine. Our objective in Ukraine now is cooperation and peace with Russia. Yes, peace. Wake up. We want peace. That is what Vladimir Putin is talking about. And this is not about he wins and we lose. No, there was never anything for us to win in eastern Ukraine. Never. It's not Kansas. It's not Missouri. It's not Texas. All we've done is destroy the Ukrainian nation. And this puppet government that we installed in Kiev has helped to kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for nothing.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And I just want to ask, just kind of categorically, it baffles my mind. I truly have a hard time getting there to understand, because we can hardly even blame the current Trump administration so far, because they haven't really done anything other than it had been in power for a week. But when you look at the previous administration, and we're talking both in and out of government, whether that's like General David Petraeus, General Ben Hodges, several other TV generals that are on all the time, the administration officials, Kaja Kallas, the Borrell before her, all these different people. You mentioned Ruta, also Stoltenberg, all of these senior people, they seem to be, I don't know, and this is what I really want your view on. Is it inability to understand what used to be strategic basics like von Clausewitz, or is it that they think that somehow that they can be smarter than that and they can achieve something besides what thousands of years of human history say is the way things work. How could we be so bad and so far off the mark as a Western nation, or was a Western mindset?
There are two answers to this question. First, look at the wealth that these people have accumulated. Where does it come from? Who's been paying them and who is paying them now? You know, how many times have you and others talked about senior officers? I had a classmate who became a brigadier general, and all he could talk about was, now I have to race to 3 or 4 stars. And if I can get to 3 or 4, I can make millions. And stop and think about that. That sort of thing goes on. These people are on a payroll. They're deriving wealth from people in New York City and Washington, D.C., and the corporations, the entities, the political structures that back them. They are rewarded for their lies. And they are all on the same sheet of music because they all benefit. The problem, of course, is that the American people don't benefit. And if this continues without a halt, and that's what I fear most of all right now, and that's why I voted for President Trump, if he doesn't put a stop to this, we will be dragged further and further into this abyss. It is not impossible that at some point, Moscow says enough and pulls the plug on us. They just say, we're not worth having around. We're not going to deal with these people anymore. We're going to destroy them. And then you have more than half the world aligned against us as it is. This is catastrophic. We don't want this. This is not going to help us. So the first answer is look at where the wealth comes from. And the second part is that if you've lied repeatedly, you know, how many, all these people that you named, how many times have they told us that the Ukrainians were on the verge of victory? Just a little more of this or a little more of that, a little more artillery ammunition, a little bit better space-based intelligence, and the Ukrainians are going to drive all the way to Moscow. How many times have you heard that nonsense? How do you back away from the lies that you've told? We couldn't do that in Vietnam. And I would remind everybody that because we couldn't tell the truth about Vietnam, where we were no less confused about what we were there to do than we are today with regard to what's happening in Ukraine, Vietnam became a stain on the honor of the American people and its armed forces. We killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese for nothing. We lost over 58,000 dead with more than 100,000 wounded. That was tragic, and that was nothing compared with what the Russians had sacrificed. But the difference is that at least the Russians have fought for Russian national interest and national security. And they've done it, I think, better than perhaps anyone has in the last century in terms of avoiding the pitfalls that confront all of us on the battlefield. You, Dan, know from personal experience, as I do, how easy it is to pull the trigger and kill large numbers of people unnecessarily. It's not difficult. They haven't done that. So the stain on our honor continues today in Ukraine. This is a disgrace. We should have had nothing to do with it. Never. We've capitalized on hatreds that spring from the depths of people's souls rooted in the Second World War. It's the worst possible thing that we could do. We need to stop it. And that's why President Trump needs to stop it and get rid of these people that are hijacking him and his administration and taking it down the path to hell.